A young struggling man saves a powerful CEO from a deadly accident, but what happens next will change both their lives in ways they never saw coming. In the bustling heart of the city, there was a stark contrast between the lives of two individuals, worlds apart in every sense of the word. On one side, there was Lucas Hayes, a young man who seemed to have the weight of the world on his shoulders. At 23, Lucas worked long hours at a rundown mechanic shop, struggling to make ends meet. The shop barely paid enough to cover his bills, and he had no family to rely on, just his worn-out work gloves and a broken-down car. His life, though simple, was marked by constant hardship and a deep yearning for something more. Yet, no matter how much he worked, the future always seemed just out of reach. Then, there was Thomas Bennett, the CEO of Bennett Industries, one of the largest corporations in the city. Thomas was a man of power, wealth, and influence, but his life was anything but fulfilling. His mansion on the outskirts of town, grand and imposing, stood as a testament to his success. Yet inside, he was a man void of joy. Every evening, he dined alone, surrounded by expensive artifacts and portraits of people long gone. His rise to the top had come at the cost of relationships, and now he was left with nothing but the hollow echoes of his own success. His wealth could buy anything, but it couldn't buy happiness. And for all his accomplishments, he felt disconnected from the world, unable to find peace in the life he'd built. The fateful day that would bring these two worlds together started just like any other. Lucas was at work, struggling to finish the repairs on a dilapidated vehicle, his hands stained with grease and his eyes tired from the constant pressure of meeting deadlines. He dreamed of a better life, but those dreams seemed impossible with each passing day. Little did he know that fate had something unexpected in store for him. On the other side of the city, Thomas Bennett was preparing for his usual, lonely commute to work. Despite his wealth, he lived a life of isolation, working tirelessly to keep his empire running, yet feeling emptier than ever before. He had long stopped enjoying the luxuries his fortune had brought him. His mind, constantly weighed down by the expectations of the board and the loneliness of his grand home, found no peace in the life he had so carefully crafted. As Thomas drove along the tracks of an old railway crossing near his estate, his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden lurch of the car. His brakes failed unexpectedly. Panic swept through him as his car lurched toward the tracks. The roar of an approaching train was deafening, but in that moment Thomas felt time slow down, as if fate itself was closing in. Then out of nowhere a figure appeared. Without a second thought, Lucas dashed toward the speeding car, his heart racing. With no hesitation, he pushed Thomas out of the car just as the train sped past, narrowly avoiding disaster. The impact of the fall left Lucas breathless and bruised, but it didn't matter. In that split second, he had saved Thomas's life. As Thomas lay there, stunned and still in shock, Lucas stumbled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had never seen someone so close to death, and the reality of what had just happened hit him like a wave. He had saved a man, but it wasn't just any man. It was a millionaire, a man whose life had seemed so distant from his own. Thomas looked up at him with wide, incredulous eyes, his mind racing to make sense of the impossible. The two men locked eyes for a moment, both stunned by the turn of events. Lucas, breathing heavily from the exertion, stood there in his work clothes, torn jeans, a grease-stained shirt, looking like the very image of someone who had no place in the world of luxury that Thomas inhabited. "Why did you do that?" Thomas managed to croak out, his voice filled with disbelief. It was a question that had no clear answer. But before Lucas could even respond, the sound of the train's screeching brakes filled the air as it passed by, and Thomas's thoughts snapped back to the danger he had just narrowly escaped. Lucas, meanwhile, wasn't thinking about the risk he'd taken. All he could focus on was the person he had just saved. There was no time to think about his own safety or how it might impact his future. He had acted on instinct. For him, it had never been about the money or status that Thomas represented. It was about doing what felt right. Thomas slowly sat up, his hand still on his chest as he tried to steady his breath. He had been seconds away from a certain death, and it was a stranger, someone whose life seemed entirely different from his own, who had saved him. For a moment, he just stared at Lucas, this young man who had risked everything without hesitation or thought for what could happen next. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked, his voice quieter now but still tinged with urgency. Thomas nodded, but his mind was whirling. There was so much he didn't understand, yet everything felt oddly clear. I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice unsteady. "It wasn't about that," Lucas responded, looking away as though it was nothing. "I just couldn't leave you there." As they stood together, with the train's roar fading into the distance, Thomas realized something. This moment, this unspoken bond between them, was more than just about survival. Lucas's actions had shattered his carefully built walls. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt something stir deep within him, a sense of connection, something he'd pushed aside for far too long in his world of business deals and corporate power plays. Yet, despite the momentary clarity, Thomas knew this was just the beginning. There was so much more that lay ahead for him and Lucas, more than either could have ever predicted. And it wasn't just about surviving a train accident, it was about finding out what was waiting for them in the future together. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself grappling with a strange sense of unease. He had always believed that success was measured by wealth and power, that the more one accumulated, the more fulfilled they would feel. Yet Lucas's selfless act on the train had disrupted that belief. The calm resolve in Lucas's eyes, the quiet courage that had led him to act without thinking of personal gain, it was a stark contrast to everything Thomas had worked so hard to build. The more Thomas reflected, the more he realized how disconnected he had become from the simple human moments that truly made life worth living. His thoughts kept returning to that day when Lucas saved him, how it wasn't out of obligation, but a deep, unspoken sense of right and wrong. In those fleeting moments of chaos, Lucas had chosen humanity over self-interest, and it had made all the difference. As he sat at his desk in the quiet of his office, surrounded by expensive furnishings and the cold weight of his success, he couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. He had everything most people could ever dream of, except the one thing that truly mattered, a connection to another person. And Lucas, the very person he owed so much to, was a reminder of what he had lost. The warmth of human compassion was a world away from his isolated existence. Thomas found himself reconsidering his initial impulse to dismiss Lucas's gesture as a mere accident. Deep down, he knew that it wasn't a coincidence. There was something about Lucas that couldn't be explained by simple chance. It was as though the young man had entered his life to teach him a lesson he hadn't been willing to learn. And despite the confusion and uncertainty that gnawed at him, Thomas couldn't ignore the truth that was unfolding before him. He had been given a second chance, not just at life but at redemption. In an unexpected turn of events, Thomas made the decision to offer Lucas a chance at something better. He couldn't put his finger on why, but he felt compelled to make a difference in Lucas's life. The idea of offering him an opportunity to work at one of his companies was an impulse that made sense only in hindsight. It wasn't about charity. It was about recognizing something valuable in someone else, something that had been missing in his own life for far too long. Lucas had been resistant at first, unsure of what to make of Thomas's offer. But there was something in the way the proposal was presented that seemed to make him reconsider. Perhaps it was the sincerity behind it, the recognition that someone saw value in him, even if he didn't fully understand why. The offer was a lifeline, a chance to step away from the exhausting cycle of survival that had defined Lucas's life up until now. As the days went on, Lucas began to adjust to his new role, though it wasn't easy. He had spent years working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. So the world of corporate offices, sleek buildings, and high expectations felt like an entirely different universe. But despite the overwhelming challenges, Lucas found a sense of purpose in his work that he hadn't experienced before. Meanwhile, Thomas observed from a distance, impressed by Lucas's unassuming dedication. It was evident that Lucas wasn't there for the fame or the recognition. He simply wanted to work, to contribute, and to prove that he was capable. This humility was a sharp contrast to the arrogance Thomas had grown accustomed to seeing in his high-powered world. It was a humility that, over time, began to erode the walls Thomas had built around himself. At the same time, Thomas couldn't help but feel a shift within himself. The idea of helping someone without expecting anything in return wasn't something he had ever considered. In his world, everything was transactional, every interaction a calculated move. Yet with Lucas, it felt different. There was no hidden agenda, no strings attached, just a genuine desire to offer a hand when someone was in need. Over the following weeks, as Lucas settled into his new role, he slowly started to make a name for himself within the company. His diligence and work ethic became apparent to everyone around him, and even the most skeptical of colleagues couldn't help but acknowledge his commitment. For Thomas, watching Lucas's transformation was a revelation. He realized that what Lucas had brought to the table wasn't just his talent or his hard work. It was something much more profound. The reminder that life was about more than success. It was about the people who mattered, the connections that could be forged, and the small, everyday moments of kindness that often went unnoticed. As Lucas's reputation began to grow, so did Thomas's sense of admiration for him. The young man had not only changed his life that fateful day on the train, but he was also slowly reshaping everything Thomas had ever known about the world. Lucas's presence, once an unexpected twist in his life, had become an anchor, holding him steady as he began to understand what truly mattered. Climax. The turning point came one fateful evening. As Thomas walked through his office, his mind was awash with thoughts of Lucas, of the young man who had unknowingly rekindled something inside him. But it was also the night that would shift everything in an even more profound way. There was an urgent call from the hospital. Lucas had been involved in an accident. The words barely sank in before Thomas found himself racing to the emergency room, panic setting in. The very person who had saved him, who had shown him what it meant to live with purpose, was now lying unconscious with nothing but uncertainty ahead. As Thomas arrived, the sterile, cold hospital halls felt as distant as his former life. His heart pounded as he approached the room where Lucas lay, a thin sheet pulled over his motionless body. The machines beeped in a steady rhythm, and for a moment time seemed to stop altogether. The doctors assured Thomas that Lucas was stable but in critical condition. He needed time to recover. But in that moment, all Thomas could think about was how everything had changed since that fateful encounter. Lucas had entered his life as a stranger, but had somehow become its cornerstone. Without realizing it, he had come to rely on the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to his name but everything to give. As hours passed, Thomas stayed by Lucas's side, unable to pull himself away. Thoughts of his own life, his wealth, his ambition, all seemed so trivial compared to the life in front of him. Lucas had never sought anything from Thomas, had never asked for anything but a chance, and here Thomas was, helpless, realizing that he owed Lucas more than he could ever repay. It was in this moment of vulnerability, standing by the side of someone who had been a lifeline to him in more ways than one, that Thomas truly grasped the depth of what Lucas's actions had meant. It wasn't just a matter of survival. It was about trust, compassion, and a connection that transcended any material wealth. Later, as Lucas regained consciousness, he weakly smiled, his eyes flickering open to meet Thomas's. There were no grand speeches or dramatic exchanges, just the quiet understanding that the bond between them had grown into something irreplaceable. Lucas's recovery was slow, but every small step was a reminder of how far they had both come. In time, he would return to his work, but now it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something greater. As Lucas healed, Thomas's understanding of life deepened further. What had begun as a simple act of gratitude, the attempt to repay Lucas's kindness, had grown into a profound change in how Thomas viewed the world. Lucas's return to work was a quiet affair. He didn't seek attention or make a big fuss about his injuries. Instead, he went back to his tasks with the same humility and work ethic that had initially drawn Thomas's admiration, but there was something undeniably different in the way he carried himself now. He had grown stronger, not just physically, but in spirit. Thomas, on the other hand, began to question everything about his own life. The wealth, the power, the success. All of it seemed less important in the grand scheme of things. Lucas had shown him that true fulfillment didn't come from accumulating things or achieving status. It came from human connections, from helping one another, from making a difference. The weeks passed, and with them, Thomas began to make significant changes in his own life. The first was a decision to step away from the day-to-day operations of his company. He began delegating responsibilities, choosing instead to focus on what truly mattered: his relationships, his purpose, and his commitment to making a positive impact on the world around him. In the months that followed, Thomas made good on his promise to repay Lucas. But his gesture was more than just a material one. It was an invitation to work alongside him in a new venture, one that focused on creating opportunities for people like Lucas, those who had the drive but lacked the means to achieve their potential. The project wasn't just about business. It was about creating something lasting, a foundation built on the principles of kindness, empathy, and opportunity. It was a culmination of everything that had transpired between them, a chance for both men to work together, not just for their own gain, but for the betterment of others. Through this partnership, Lucas became more than just a beneficiary of Thomas's generosity. He became an equal, a partner in every sense of the word, and in doing so, both men found a new purpose, one that was far more meaningful than anything they had ever achieved alone. As the days passed, the tension between Thomas and Lucas grew. Both men had their own expectations for how the project should unfold, and their personalities were clashing more often than ever. Thomas, with his years of experience and methodical approach, found Lucas's unorthodox methods frustrating. Lucas, on the other hand, was growing impatient with Thomas's meticulous nature, feeling as if the businessman was only focused on results and not on the people they were trying to help. But just as it seemed like their partnership might collapse under the weight of their differences, a moment of unexpected crisis brought them together. A large group of people, some of them longtime supporters of the foundation, had gathered in one of the communities they had been working with to celebrate the success of the program. The event was meant to showcase how far they had come and how many lives they had touched, but things quickly spiraled out of control. A series of misunderstandings and poor communication led to a chaotic situation. Protests broke out, and some of the people who had been promised support began to feel betrayed. It was the perfect storm, and in the middle of it all, Lucas felt the weight of failure bearing down on him. This was the moment when everything they had worked for could come crashing down. Thomas, who had always been the steady, unflappable one, felt his own world start to unravel as well. But then, in the midst of the commotion, something unexpected happened. Lucas, in his usual bold fashion, took charge of the situation. He stepped into the crowd, his voice calm yet firm, and slowly but surely, he began to calm the angry voices around him. As Lucas stood in the middle of the crowd, guiding the situation with unwavering confidence, Thomas watched from the sidelines. It was clear that the young man had a natural talent for managing crises, something that Thomas had failed to recognize until now. Lucas didn't need a carefully thought-out plan. He just acted, trusting his instincts and the people around him, and it was working. Thomas felt a shift inside himself as he observed Lucas's leadership. The businessman had always been so used to controlling every aspect of his life, making sure every decision was carefully calculated. But Lucas's ability to adapt, to trust people, and to move with the flow was something that Thomas had never truly understood. And now, as he stood there, watching Lucas take control of the situation. Thomas felt a deep sense of respect for him. In that moment, Thomas understood that he had been wrong to dismiss Lucas's approach. He had been so focused on the bottom line and the success of the project that he had forgotten the human element, the very thing that Lucas had reminded him of. As the crowd's anger began to subside and the tension eased, Thomas walked up to Lucas, his expression filled with admiration. It wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about the realization that their differences were actually their greatest strength. They needed each other. Lucas's raw determination and ability to connect with people balanced out Thomas's cold, calculated approach. Together, they were unstoppable. But the biggest revelation came when Lucas turned to Thomas and, without hesitation, admitted something that had been weighing on him. He had feared for the future of the project. He had feared that, despite all the hard work, everything would collapse, and he would be left alone once again. This vulnerability caught Thomas off guard. It wasn't something he expected from Lucas, who had always seemed so sure of himself. For the first time in their partnership, Thomas saw Lucas for who he truly was, a young man who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And while Lucas had often put up a confident front, the truth was that he had his own fears, his own doubts, and his own vulnerabilities. Thomas could relate to that feeling all too well. He had been there once, when everything seemed like it might fall apart, and all you could do was keep moving forward. As Lucas spoke, Thomas couldn't help but be moved by his words. It was clear that the young man had learned a great deal in a short amount of time. He had evolved from the impulsive, uncertain figure that Thomas had first met into a true leader, one who could inspire, guide, and make tough decisions when necessary. This moment was pivotal for both of them. It was the moment that marked the true beginning of their partnership, a moment when they both realized that they needed each other to succeed. Lucas's raw passion and relentless determination complemented Thomas's experience and strategic thinking. Together, they formed the perfect balance. Just as Thomas was about to speak, a shout echoed through the crowd. One of the protesters, emboldened by the calm that had started to settle over the crowd, raised his voice in defiance. This was the final test for Lucas. Would he be able to hold on to the fragile peace they had just created? Could he navigate the situation without it spiraling out of control again? Without missing a beat, Lucas stepped forward once more. He didn't shout back or try to overpower the protester. Instead, he simply asked a question, one that shifted the energy of the crowd in an instant. He asked about their hopes, their dreams, and their vision for the future. It wasn't just about talking at them anymore. It was about listening to them, understanding them, and showing them that their voices mattered. As Lucas continued to speak, the crowd quieted. What began as chaos was slowly transforming into a conversation, a dialogue where both sides felt heard and respected. And in that moment, Thomas saw something incredible happen. Lucas had done it. He had not only calmed the crowd but had changed their perspective. No longer were they focused on their frustrations. They were now thinking about the future, about the ways they could all work together. The young man had turned a near disaster into an opportunity for growth and collaboration. It was a turning point, not just for the project, but for their relationship. Thomas, who had once doubted Lucas's abilities, now realized that he had been wrong. Lucas's heart was in the right place, and his ability to connect with people was a rare gift. After the crowd dispersed, with many of the protesters now offering their support, Thomas and Lucas stood together, taking in what had just occurred. The crisis had been averted, but the true impact of what had happened was yet to be fully realized. Both men understood that this moment would define the future of their partnership and the success of the foundation. For Thomas, it wasn't just about business anymore. It was about people, about understanding their needs, their hopes, and their dreams. And Lucas, for the first time, had shown him that it was possible to build something lasting, something meaningful, if you truly cared about the people you were trying to help. The The crisis was over, but in its aftermath, both men were forever changed, and as they stood together side by side, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as equals. They were no longer just business partners. They were a team, bound by mutual respect and a shared vision for a better future.